Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Byline with Ben Dennis. I got an exciting conversation today with a former member of the Secret Service on the presidential detail. Served in the force for over 2 decades, 22 years. His name is Jeffrey James. Jeffrey James was an English teacher in high school, born and raised in Pennsylvania, something we both share. But then he had a little conversation with a mutual connection about possibly becoming a cop, protecting the president. He went all in on it. Ultimately, was promoted to assistant special agent in charge. He also was the Secret Service liaison to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. However, this is what was part of his bio, if he wasn't already interesting enough, that piqued my interest, is he also studied national security resource strategy with a centralized focus, a concentration in weapons of mass destruction, WMDs as they're called. Right now, when there's a lot of chatter about Iran, their nuclear capabilities, how much of a nuclear program that they may have left after Operation Midnight Hammer, as it were called, that happened last summer when we were told by the president and the Defense Department that it was obliterated. How much are we able to gather intelligence to see if that was actually true? What checks can we have right now when clearly they're not going to let America into the country and assess what the status of their nuclear program is? How can we utilize resources that are already there? Maybe a possible spy from another country, also using, no doubt, satellite imagery to see if they may be wanting to build back, opening up a new building, grazing the ground, etc. So we get into a lot of the intelligence gathering and deterrence mechanisms of someone building a nuclear program. With the initial pitches, when they go to the UN, say, hey, we want to start one. It's actually for our energy grid. We want to have a cleaner country. Or if there are some more ill underlying intentions. Jeff's got some insight on this. He also is discussing the day-to-day as a Secret Service agent. There are any misconceptions. Talks about some of the capabilities that we have right now in protecting the president. He shares some stories about his time protecting our second Bush president, George W. Bush. And after he says that there was a bounty, a target put on his children, Jenna and Barbara, how the Secret Service reacted in that moment. He's got some personal stories about protecting the president in rural America, but also the slower days, if you will. He's not only sharing more about his time in the service, 22 years, but also his insight into what maybe we should be asking, looking for, as we're still being told by top levels of our federal government that we're looking to dismantle their nuclear program and make sure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon. I'm excited to chat with Jeff. Let's do it. And joining me now on Byline is Jeff James, retired Secret Service agent with the presidential detail, 22 years of service. Correct me if I'm wrong, sir. However, the origin story, as I know it from your website, is you were an educator, high school teacher, and also a Pennsylvania man. Two things that we have connections. My father is an educator. He was my high school principal. My mother's an educator, and I also grew up in Pennsylvania. So we've got those two factions to share.
Very cool.
Jeff, I found it interesting in your bio, you also studied national security resource strategy with a concentration in weapons of mass destruction. And I thought, now there's widespread talk about dismantling Iran's nuclear capabilities. And on top of our previous conversation that we had in my local news capacity here in Washington, D.C., I wanted to jump back on a call with you. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me.
Of course. So I'll start with the basics. High school teacher. Then you a Secret Service agent? Why the jump?
Well, like every decision most men make, it's about a girl, right? So, so I was teaching high school. I taught high school English for about 6 years before I went to law enforcement. But during that time, I had a friend who her cousin was a Secret Service agent, and I became acquainted with him. And he put the bug in my ear about applying. And I always had an interest in law enforcement. In fact, all I ever wanted to do growing up was either be a teacher or be a cop. And I've been blessed to do both. But he kind of approached me, said, hey, did you ever think about applying? And I said, no, I don't think they'd hire me. I don't have a law enforcement or military background. And what I know now is that, that's not necessary. The Secret Service wants an intentionally diverse workforce, diverse in all ways, not just male, female things, but diverse backgrounds. I went ahead and applied. And at that time, the process took a while. About a year and a half later, they were silly enough to hire me. So, but The reason I say, it's about a girl is because I kinda kept putting the gentleman off saying, "No, they'll never hire me, they'll never hire me," and finally she goes, "Well, why don't you just give it a try?" And I went, "Oh, okay." So, um, so it ended up,
Did you end up with that gal?
what's that?
Did you end up with the girl?
I didn't, but, we still keep some fringe contact, we're certainly not close, but, we certainly, see each other from time to time, we chat a little bit,
That's
yes.
fair. I'm not here to prod your personal
No, no.
life. I was just curious that you brought it up. So when you first joined, what were your expectations and what did you quickly realize was reality in that job?
Well, I will tell you, I went into it with my eyes wide open because I had a gentleman named Joe Trainer who was my first boss in the Secret Service, but as I was coming on, I was in the hiring process, he was kind of mentoring me along the way and let me know like, "Hey, this is gonna be a grind." The operational tempo of the Secret Service, people say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Well, the Secret Service is a marathon where you're sprinting the whole time. And he was very frank with me about, "Hey, you're gonna miss birthdays and holidays." And when I came on, I was single, so that helped a lot. But it was, you know, it was more exciting than I ever thought it would be. And I'll just tell you quickly, I grew up without much. I was the youngest of 7 kids in a home with a dirt floor in the basement and 1 bathroom and, south of Pittsburgh, and never really traveled as a kid. And even as an adult, once I kind of got out on my own, never traveled a lot. But then I got in the Secret Service and I put my feet on every continent except Antarctica. So that part was very exciting. And, being around history when it happened, of course, was very exciting. But it was a grind. I mean, there were times that I was literally away from didn't sleep in my own bed for a month and a half sometimes. So it was exactly what I expected from that point, the negative, but I think the positive was more exciting to me than I had anticipated, for sure.
You joined the force before 9/11. How much did that event fundamentally change not just how you woke up every single day and tackled the job, but even just, the requirements and the execution of the job at
Well,
that point?
so we were already at a pretty high operational capacity at that point. The only thing in the very short time after September 11th that changed was we added some new sensors around the White House that would detect any kind of biological or chemical that was being released. Those were kind of new. But other than that, not a whole lot changed. The military, we always worked very closely with the military and got great support from them. And I think that ticked up a little bit. Like maybe some more air escorts for Air Force One that we hadn't seen. Yeah, I think people think Air Force One goes around with escorts all the time, fighter escorts all the time, and it doesn't. But we did see that uptick in certain situations a little bit more. And I think we just got better at paying attention to the intelligence because that was, the Secret Service is a consumer of intelligence, right? We get it from the NSA, CIA, folks like that. We don't really go out and develop our own intelligence. We consume it and disseminate it. But I do think we got better after September 11th at listening to the intelligence we were getting and things that maybe before September 11th, people would have said, seems a little far-fetched. We were looking at it with new eyes saying, well, no, this could happen. So that was probably the biggest change. But operationally, there wasn't really any difference at all.
I mean, nobody could think that it was fathomable that 4 commercial airliners could get hijacked. In such that tragedy that unfolded. And you answer my question right there. My follow-up is, how did 9/11 change the way that threats were understood? And you talk about that relationship with the intelligence community there. So what was there a moment where it hit you, this is no longer just protection, it's also part of a bigger national security system, being on the service, even though it's not, as you had mentioned, solely an intelligence gathering operation?
Well, that was ingrained to us from the very beginning in training because we didn't just protect the president, we protected the vice president, certain members of the cabinet, the DHS secretary and the Treasury secretary, all the other cabinet members have protection from their own directorates. But we kind of always had the idea that the protection of national security it started with us. And if we were to see a plot, again, like John Wilkes Booth and his cohorts tried to pull in on April 14th, 1865, when they wanted to kill the president and the vice president and the secretary of state and everybody and really lop the top of the head off the government. We were the barrier between whoever had that plot and the preservation of our managing government. So that was ingrained to us from the very beginning that, we were that line. And I'm not giving away too much because people know it exists, but we even had, do you remember the show that was out for a while with Kiefer Sutherland, Designated Survivor?
Yes, I do. In fact, if that pops up, I'll binge a couple episodes. I
All right,
do.
yeah,
Yes.
that's a real thing that we do. Parts of it are classified, and certainly, well, 90% of it's classified, but that does exist. We would take every State of the Union and every inauguration, we would take one member of government, and we would whisk them away and hide them somewhere. That way, if that catastrophic event happened and everybody was killed in the Capitol explodes and the president, vice president, speaker of the House, all the senators and congressmen are killed, there's still one person left to run the United States. And that, again, was a responsibility we took very seriously.
So I'm sure you quickly learned some of what the common misconceptions the public might have about the service as soon as you had joined the force. So what do you think some of the biggest misconceptions were about protecting the president day to day?
Um, yeah, I'll tell you the biggest one I encountered all the time was the assumption that it was this huge agency, right? That there were a million secret service. One guy actually said that to me one time when I asked him, how many Secret Service agents do you think there are? He said a million. Um, in my career, we always hovered around 2,000 agents, about 1,500 of our uniformed officers, which was our Washington, D.C. based police force who protected the White House and the president's residence and the foreign missions, things like that. Then the rest of our folks, when we were most of my career around 7,000 people, everybody else was like non-gun carriers. So our forensic scientists, our attorneys, our administrative folks. So I think that the most common misconception was what an incredibly small agency we were. Realized that we had, at times in my career, again, 7,000 total employees, and the FBI had 25,000 just agents. And then they had all their officers and non-gun carriers. So that was the biggest misconception. And that's why the operational tempo was always so high, was because there was only so many of us to go around a lot of times. And then the other responsibility the Secret Service had was we would also protect all foreign heads of state. So anytime any foreign king, president, prime minister, the pope, any of those folks came to the United States, they got a Secret Service detail. So every year in September, when you see the United Nations General Assembly turn on and there's 140 heads of state visiting, that's 140 separate protective details that the Secret Service has to staff. So, we're not just talking, if all we did was protect the president, it would be easy. We'd have plenty of people. But when you throw in the
And
president,
you're talking all world leaders, even the worst of the worst adversaries,
correct. Yeah,
right?
there was twice actually where I had to protect Robert Mugabe, who, I'm not going to bog down your listeners. You can Google him, but he was the president of Zimbabwe, and he was a terrible person. And one time when we were protecting him in New York, somebody was attempting to get through us to serve him with papers where he would have to go in front of the UN and answer to being a war criminal. So yeah, you know, the philosophy
Did you
then,
block them, or did they ultimately get through?
they did. Yeah, we stopped them, and we told them, this isn't going to happen. And I think they ended up handing the paperwork to one of his handlers or his helpers or whatever. But our attitude among my colleagues and myself was, if it would turn out that the CIA decided they wanted to get rid of this guy, we would hope they would have the courtesy to either do it in his country or blow up his plane when he's going home. And because if they wanted to do it on American soil, they would have to get through us to do it. But we would hope they would have the courtesy not to do that, because even if they did it in some way that didn't
And put you
hurt
guys
any
in
of us
jeopardy.
physically, they didn't try to shoot him or. Yeah, but it certainly would. Even if they poisoned his tea that he drank at night and we woke up the next morning and he was dead, it would certainly damage our reputation if a foreign head of state dies under Secret Service protection. So we would have hoped they, it never came to that eventuality, but we did have that discussion that this is a bad guy. And there are certainly people who wouldn't be upset if he was off the earth, for sure.
Were there, I'll use that to piggyback. Were there ever instances where your own kind of morals kicked in that may have defied protocol and you had to take a beat?
No, because it's all about the mission. My political views, my moral compass, I would like to believe, always points straight north. And if I didn't agree with what a foreign head of state was doing, that was for me to leave at home, because my mission at the time was, I was essentially acting as a diplomat for the United States to make sure that that person got here safely and went home safely.
Front-facing example of America's national security.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, our stature We can't allow our stature in the world to falter, even if a foreign state from a small country dies here because I wasn't mission focused. So that's where it is. And even people ask me all the time too. The other misconception, to go back to what you said, and it kind of ties in both your last couple questions, is people would say to me two things. One, are you allowed to vote? Which we are, of course. And two, how could you protect that person? How could you protect Clinton? He was off. How could you protect Bush? He was down. And our thing is, you know what? You elect them. Our stupid little saying: you elect them, we protect them. We don't care who it is. We protect the office of the president, the office of the vice president, and politics are meaningless to us.
Is there ever a normal day in the Secret Service?
Well, boredom is great in any form of law enforcement, whether you're a local law enforcement guy in your town, whether you're a state trooper, whether you're a federal agent, boredom is good. And there were plenty of times where the president didn't leave the Oval Office all day. We would hold, in the West Wing there, we would hold posts around the Oval Office. If he was in there all day, we called it Ring Around the Oval. You would just push through your posts and you'd have a half hour to go get off your feet and do your paperwork. And then you just go through the cycle again. And yeah, so boring days were good, but the boring days never trumped, the excitement of, being on Marine One and being on Air Force One and going out to cities. Cause I'll tell you what I really never got jaded about in my entire career was how exciting it was. Like the goosebumps I still get when I think that they just let me walk into the White House and that I got to see almost every day of my career a president or a former president or, the Pope or Vladimir Putin or all these people that we protected. If you have a minute for a quick story.
Yeah, sure.
So in 1998, Arnold Palmer, of course, was a very famous golfer. In 1998, his wife passed away, Winnie, and they lived in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. I'm sure you've heard of. Latrobe's only really known for three things. One, it was Arnold Palmer's home. Oh no, I'm going to give you four. Arnold Palmer's home, Mr. Rogers' home. It's where the Steelers hold training camp at St. Vincent University, and it's known for St. Vincent University. Those are the only four things that Latrobe is really known for. So I get a call and they say, hey, Mrs. Palmer passed away. President Bush, the former President Bush, wants to go to the funeral. Just run up there and set up the security as quickly as you can. So I go up.
We're talking HW at this
Correct,
point.
yeah. So I go up. I forget what day of the week I go there, but say it was Tuesday. I had Wednesday to prepare everything, and the funeral was Thursday. Well, Thursday, they land. Thursday comes, and the president lands in a small airplane at the time it was Latrobe Regional Airport. Now it's Arnold Palmer Airport. And they get off the plane, and the boss who got off the plane with him says to me, hey, Jeff, we have a little problem. And the president comes up to me and he says, hey, I was in an event before this and I changed on the plane and I forgot a belt. Is there a menswear store anywhere where we can go get a belt? And I said, sir, the only thing even close to here is there's a Kmart out on Route 30. And he looks at me and he says, well, we're going to Kmart. So we're walking through Kmart and the president's ahead of us. So the boss said, hey, just you and I will go in with him. We don't want to create a stir. So the boss the president's walking ahead of us and you see people would look at him and they'd kind of shake their head like, nah, it couldn't be. And then they'd see us with the earpieces. So he goes to the back of the store and he finally picks a belt. And by the time we get to the register, there's probably 25 people standing there just with wide eyes, right? Looking at the president. And he was just very gracious and he shook hands, but everybody knew he was there for the funeral. So he, said, hey, I don't have much time. And he made his way out. And that story, to me, there's two things I love about it. One is that was a once in a lifetime moment for those people. And it was a once in a lifetime moment that I got all the time. And I will never forget what a blessing it was. But the other part that makes me laugh is there are still people to this day who are going to family reunions and class reunions and parties telling the story of how they saw the president in a Kmart in Latrobe, and nobody believes them. They all think
Of course,
they're
why
making it
would
up or
they?
that
Even just seeing Air Force One touchdown
Right.
in your neck of the woods is
Yeah.
something to behold, right?
Right.
It's just
Yeah.
the imagery there.
Yeah, it really is. And
So-
the things, I don't know. I'll just never shake what how humbling and And again, just how fortunate and blessed I was to experience that stuff for sure.
Certainly, you had plenty of experience and conversation with those who were in the intelligence field, but you had that special moment where you were able to have some additional educational opportunities with national security resource strategy. So as you became more senior, especially with your background here, how did your thinking shift from possibly reacting to threats to anticipating them? How did that education come into play in your day to day?
Well, I think what you really learn when you're first new to the job, the answer is all the not the answer, I'm sorry, the questions are all the why can'ts. Why can't we have more people here? And why can't we do this differently? And why can't we utilize technology better? But as you move up and you get more responsibility and you see, instead of the picture from 10,000 feet, now you're seeing it from 40,000 feet, you realize because there's other responsibilities that maybe when you were a younger agent you didn't know about. Budget is always a consideration. The budget wasn't limitless. One of the flaws I had was in 2003, or one of the flaws in my thinking was in 2003 when we went from the Department of Treasury to Homeland Security. I thought, oh, this is going to be great. We'll have this giant checkbook. Things are going to get better. The problem with Homeland Security is there's 33 different directorates under it, and we are a very small agency under that, fighting for budget, and it just doesn't translate that this small
In a
agency
brand
gets
spanking new
more money
department.
than the Coast Guard, right? So we're not going to get more money than them. So, but I think you just get a more worldly view of the entire agency as you get older. But it also makes you better at the logistics of it, of moving people around, of moving vehicles around, of getting people and equipment where they need to go in a more efficient manner. Now, as far as the threat level goes, we were always very well schooled on emerging threats, not just current threats, but emerging threats. Like I remember when we found out after we killed Saddam Hussein's sons, the government that was left in Iran put a $30 million bounty on the heads of each of President Bush's daughters, Barbara and Jenna. So we reacted to that immediately. And I forget where Barbara was, but Jenna was down at the University of Texas, and we sent, along to supplement her detail. I was we would go down for a couple weeks at a time. I was part of a tactical element that they sent to supplement that. And we reacted to, as soon as we heard about it, we reacted to it very quickly. So again, not just knowing the current threats, but reacting to the emerging threats is what's important. And I think a lot of the flaws that you see, look, anything could sneak up on you, right? Like a sleeper cell could flip their switch today and attack 15 churches or 10 malls or however they would want to do it. But I think you just have to you have to believe the intelligence you're getting rather than being skeptical of it and react to it. And I think we always did a nice job at that of reacting to the intelligence.
What's the framework that national security officials are using to assess specific threats? And then I want to transition into specifically about WMDs.
Well, I think it's a few things. We have, when I say we, I mean the federal government. We have sources all over the place, right? The estimation is there's about 10,000 spies in Washington, D.C. from all the different countries, right? China has them, Russia has them, Israel is probably the same in Moscow, probably the same in every major capital.
Where's this 10,000 figure coming from, by the way?
That was a figure that was given to me in a briefing I got from the State Department, but it's stale. That was probably in 2017. I got that briefing that they estimated about 10,000 spies in Washington, D.C. And again, it's probably the same in all the big capitals. I don't know how easy it would be to get those kind of assets into like North Korea, but my point is, so we're listening to the human intelligence that we get, right? We got these sources that are infiltrating groups and giving us information. And when I say us again, I mean the government. We also have electronic measures where we're intercepting chatter, and I think what happens is when you have a nexus of those two things, when you have a human source who's telling you, hey, we're hearing that group A is about 90% ready to launch their attack. They only need X, Y, and Z, and then they're going to go. And then you start to hear the chatter that mirrors that. Now we have that intersection of those two things. And now that's when alerts get put out. Like you would see around, was there one right before Christmas this year about targeting houses of worship and things like that? And the FBI's, and this is all the whole of government, right? All the all the alphabets, right? FBI, DEA, ATF, CIA, NSA, everybody's working together on this now. And that's when you'll see the warnings go out. In the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, so in I think 1995, the laws were created around that. Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 2332, that says, like, all right, this is how we're defining weapons of massive destruction, and these are the penalties for violating these statutes. If you look on their website today, you probably in if you would go back less than a year in their press releases, you're going to find over a dozen arrests for violating that statute. We know people, both foreign intelligence actors and American citizens, are attempting to either mass up weapons of something to make a weapon of mass destruction, like ammonium nitrate, or they're trying to give help to a foreign government that could develop a weapon of mass destruction. That was a long answer to your story, their question, though, that when we see two pieces of intelligence intersect, regardless of how we get them, we act on it. And that's when I say we, again, I mean the federal government and all of law enforcement are able to arrest these people, because we're not going to sit back and say, oh, they're ready to go. Let's see what happens. We're going to move on it, and we're going to put people in prison.
When we talk about something like Iran and nuclear capability, how much of that is about intelligence gathering versus deterrence and potential military action? I mean, last June, July, we had Operation Midnight Hammer, as it was, where we allegedly obliterated their nuclear program. That was the terminology that we were given. But back to my question, how much of it is about intelligence gathering and potentially actual ammunition, missiles?
Well, one of the problems that we have globally, and this is a lot of my opinion here, one of the problems I believe we have globally is we're not doing enough to control what rogue states are doing with nuclear capability. Like the UN will say there's sanctions available, and maybe even the EU will get involved a little bit, but nobody's ever really doing anything. So when you look at a state like Iran, who doesn't look to hide anything about their disdain for the United States and Israel and other countries around them, Qatar, folks like that, and we know they're developing these weapons, somebody has to do something. And we try to act, with our allies if we can, but if we can't, we're in a lot of ways protecting our own interests. And I don't want to turn this into a political talk, because that's really not my style. But when I talk about the protection of the United States, there sometimes comes a need for us to say to that rogue nation, okay, we're going to be the ones to stop you, because the processes of what should happen through the UN and things like that, we found aren't working. They ignore. It's been decades where Iran has been ignoring calls from the UN to stand down on their nuclear development. So if I understand your question right, we get that intelligence that they're developing these weapons, or they have the means to develop weapons, and we want to stop it. Are you asking kind of like, are we poking the bear when we do that? Or are you asking?
Yeah, I would say so. And I'm sure every nation, every state is different. They're going to handle, or at least react to, a military strike differently, maybe targeting public infrastructure, energy grids, etc. Maybe holding a general hostage, and you try and have diplomatic talks in order to lower the tension, etc. But yeah, I was just generally curious, if we're talking about dismantling a nuclear program, is it primarily going in with missiles and these bunker busters, or is it diplomatic talks, even at this stage right now when we are actively at war?
Yeah, it's kind of what I alluded to before, and you put it more eloquently than I would. I don't think the diplomatic talk, and again, I'm trying not to make this political, but I think it's been decades of diplomatic talks that haven't worked. It gets to the point where, sanctions don't work, and trying to be good neighbors doesn't work, and threats don't work. And at some point you have to say, we're going to take a stronger stand, a military stand. Now, I love the technology of what we can do. I'm thankful that we don't have to put boots on the ground in Iran to do this, that we can. And I know there's a criticism of,
at this stage in the game.
Yeah, there's a criticism that, we're fighting our wars from 40,000 feet. Well, we have the technology to do that. So why would we ever reenact D-Day trying to storm a beach if we didn't have to do that?
It's cost effective, and you're not putting lives at risk, or at least you're not putting American lives risk.
Correct. But I think the intelligence also does a good job, and a little peek inside things that I saw, and I don't know if I'm telling anybody anything they don't know, but these strikes are often planned when, and I got this from a buddy of mine who worked in the CIA, like we'll intentionally hit places at 2 in the morning. So we know it's not, um, an, a facility that's full of people. So that way we're not killing 70 people who just went to work that day. You know, might there be a janitor working who unfortunately loses his life on the midnight shift? Yeah. But we're intentionally doing that to minimize the number of lives we lose in an effort to dismantle this capability that they have. So there is a thought process behind it too that is as humanitarian as it can be. And this isn't just now. This has been for decades through all administrations that we're gonna minimize the loss of civilian life as much as we can. But ultimately, the goal still is that we have to destroy this facility. But again, we're not going to do it at noon when it's full of people.
Even before that, from a strategy standpoint, what does effective intelligence gathering on a nuclear program look like? Are there certain signals that folks are trying to detect?
Yeah, well, so it's the signals of the capability, right? Like if you say you want to start a nuclear program, it could be years before you're able to enrich uranium and get it to the point where it can be weaponized. So you saying you as a small nation saying you want to start a nuclear program probably isn't going to set off many sirens until you get to the point where, again, you can develop that program to weaponize it. So, but again, that's going to be the human intelligence that we get from people inside and that are able to say, I developed this source who works in the nuclear plant, and now they have the yellow cake ready to go.
But even before, even if uranium is enriched at any point after, as you had mentioned, the moment where a nation says, "Hey, we want to start a nuclear capability," and I know we're being tongue in cheek here, are there still ways to prevent and actively go in and make sure that they don't even reach the point when they have the yellow cake, as you mentioned?
I think at that point, it's probably more diplomatic. It's probably talks through the United Nations where they say, look, if you're looking, why do you want to develop this program? Well, we want to power our entire nation. We can't keep using oil. We don't have coal. We want to power our entire nation off of a nuclear, not matrix, grid.
Grid.
Yeah. Okay, we'll help you develop that. Like, we will work with you as larger nations, as nations who've developed this already to build that. You don't need to build it on your own, right? But if that nation says, no, 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 we're good. We want to develop this ourselves. That's when you're probably going to keep a closer eye on what they want to do. So I think the involvement of larger nations, of friendly nations helps because I think it starts in that first moment of, hey, we'd like to give this a try. That the question is going to be the why. And if it is truly to enhance the power in your country and run the world a little greener rather than continuing to burn oil and coal and gasoline and things like that, then maybe small program in a small country isn't a bad thing.
You may have just answered my question, given human resources, sources, maybe technical, let's say even like satellite imagery as well. And my question was, how much confidence can intelligence agencies have realistically when they're tracking something as complex as a nuclear program? But
Yeah.
to your point, you've got your sources, whether it be in the sky from a satellite or folks who are on the ground.
Yeah, and when you really see, so the satellite portion is something I didn't mention earlier when I talked about human intelligence and I talked about chatter. There is also the surveillance portion as well, the satellite stuff. And I think what happens in the satellite stuff is they look, there's people looking at photos every day. And when they start to see the changes, right, you can't build a building without it standing out. So all of a sudden, all right, this used to be a field. Now it's cleared and flat. All right, now they've done uh, a basement that, or I'm sorry, there's a big dugout here, area dug out where they're going to put in the foundation of a building. Okay, now they're starting to build. Now the questions will go to the human side and the chatter side where we're going to try to figure out what they're building. And you look for that movement, you look for changes. And that could have been something very simple as, the country says, hey, we want to start a nuclear program. And people are saying, well, let's wait. But now all of a sudden in an area where, um, you know, the scientists would tell us would be ideal for building a nuclear reactor, you're seeing this giant uptick in construction. okay, now we're going to keep a closer eye on everything.
How often are major decisions made with incomplete or evolving intelligence? And how do officials manage that risk?
Yeah, so intelligence is wrong all the way from street cops all the way up. It's wrong sometimes, right? That street cop hears from his informant that a big drug deal is going to go down on Tuesday night at the corner of First and Main. And they surveil First and Main Tuesday night and nothing happens, right? So intelligence is wrong. And you never know when you're caught in that because it could be the bad guys knowing your informant, feeding them bad intelligence to A, let you chase your tail for a little bit, but B, now they've figured out who the informant is. So, because I've only told one person that that drug deal is going to happen at First and Main, and now I see you set up. Now I know that that person is your source. So it's never perfect. You know, I think the failures that came from lack of intelligence or lack of intelligence sharing have been more significant than just getting bad information. Because if you get information, you're going to react to it. And better to react to it than not and be wrong than to say, oh, we're going to ignore that piece of intelligence and then something bad happens. So, like I said, the failures of intelligence sharing have been more detrimental than just somebody telling you a story they heard that ended up being wrong.
So, from a strategic lens, what's the hardest part? Stopping a program or verifying that it's actually been stopped?
Geez, well, you know, if you're willing to swing a big hammer, stopping it's easy. You know, you start with diplomacy, you give them a timeline, and if they don't respond, then you act kinetically. The verification can be tough because, you know, the chatter might not coincide with the human intelligence you're getting. The satellite imagery is going to be, it is what it is. But if you're seeing a building being built, but it doesn't coincide with anything you're hearing from the human intelligence side and the chatter, then it might be an apartment building. You never know. So the verification can be tough. And sometimes people just guess wrong. You know, I always go back to World War II when FDR and Stalin and Churchill met in Casablanca and the Nazis intercepted it. And, you know, Casablanca means White House. So they assumed the meeting was taking place at the White House, not in Casablanca, because they could have assassinated all three of them in Casablanca, but just thought, oh, it's happening at the White House. So there's sometimes incorrect assumptions or incorrect interpretations of intelligence also that, you know, might not be totally detrimental, but might get you to look at a fastball down the middle and not swing at it too.
So, after the bunker busters went in on Operation Midnight Hammer, we were told that the nuclear program was obliterated, and we're now entering 1 month, week 4 of this war with Iran. The goals they've not necessarily changed, but the goals are not clearly articulated from everybody in the top levels of the government. Is it regime change? Is it knocking out the nuclear program, etc.? So after we were told that the nuclear program was obliterated, say it was in the moment, what does the process look like for the U.S. to verify that it has? Because I remember there were some stories that there was some satellite imagery of some trucks near these suspected bunkers where missiles possibly were arriving ahead of Operation Midnight Hammer and possibly were moving any type of enriched materials as well. So what was the government likely doing right after that and leading up to 4 weeks ago?
Yeah. So probably, you know, we don't have the ability to go in and check, right? Iran's not going to let us come in and look around. So, you know, we have to trust a couple of things. One, if there are going to be assessors and inspectors from the United Nations going in, we have to trust what they're allowed to see and what they're reporting back. And that might be where this started. You know, if an independent assessor and inspector from another country said, yeah, you know, they're building back up again, maybe that's where this came from. But we're also going to look at the intelligence community, right? So maybe we have a spy from Russia who is in Iran, who sees them rebuilding, who knows maybe his country doesn't want to get involved, but also his country is vulnerable because of their proximity to Iran. And maybe they talk to their counterpart in the CIA and say, hey, this is happening. So when it comes to intelligence and the intelligence community, countries that seem like enemies, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that is very real. So the information sharing isn't always between the United States and England and Israel and Japan, the people we're allies with. Sometimes you're crossing a line to make sure for the greater good and a little bit of selfishness among these countries too, to say, hey, this is what's happening behind your back. You might want to take a closer look at it.
Given an apparent no end in sight here, President Trump had some chatter that he would hope to wind down the war, but Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was just on Meet the Press today as we record on a Sunday and said sometimes the way to de-escalation is escalation. And now we're in this 48-hour window after President Trump went on Truth Social and said, hey, you got 48 hours to open the Strait of Hormuz, or we're going to go after your energy infrastructure, the grid, if you will, the power grid. So when you look at the world right now, what should people be understanding about where this is heading and what happens next from your perspective?
Well, hopefully the clearer minds are going to prevail, right? That the Iranians, look, they could drag this out a long time. We've seen it happen before. We've seen them do it against other nations.
Their entire regime is at risk, right?
Right.
So why wouldn't they?
So you'd like to think, though, the cooler heads would prevail at some point. They'd say, all right, let's at least talk. Like, we'll open the Strait of Hormuz if you can guarantee no more strikes for the next 3 weeks or whatever, however those bargains are made. Now, if they dig their heels in and say, go to hell, if you try to sail through here, we're gonna defend our, we're in charge of the strait and we're gonna hurt anybody who tries to come through. They're probably going to bring down heat on themselves from more than just the United States, because we're certainly not the only country that uses the strait, right? So you'd like to think cooler heads are going to prevail. If they don't, I could see this. And again, this isn't my area of expertise. This is just Jeff James' opinion. I could see this not necessarily escalating violence-wise, but I could see more countries coming in and saying, all right, we were hesitant to get involved at first, but now, like, we have a dog in the fight now. And whether they get involved diplomatically or whether they lend kinetic support or men and material is kind of yet to be seen. But if that strait is held hostage for a long time, it's going to it's going to affect the global economy at some point.
And who knows, because President Trump had also answered a question, I believe it was on the South Lawn of the White House before he got onto Marine One, or whether he was getting off, and he said, why would I want a ceasefire right now? So if we're just going to continue to bomb Iran and their military facilities, whatever it may be, why would cooler heads prevail at that point if you're Iran, if you're constantly being threatened?
But I do think militarily, you give a country the opportunity to say uncle. You don't keep chasing them just because they retreat sometimes. Sometimes you get to that line and you hold that line. And so if they're not continually being defiant, like if they would say, we'll open the strait, I don't think we continue to attack, of course. We take that win and we let things start to recover at that point. Because I think there was some people who were interpreting that as saying, even if we get what we want, why would we stop attacking? At that point, I don't think that would be wise or even correct to do. But sometimes the only thing, I kind of equate it to a neighbor, right? If you have a neighbor who keeps letting their dog go to the bathroom on your lawn and they don't clean it up, and you've asked them 10 times nicely, at some point you're going to have to.
You're going to leave the doggy doo-doo on the doorstep.
Right, for sure. So, we've certainly got to that point. Now now we're reacting, and now we do have to give them a chance to say uncle at some point.
Last thing I have for you, and I don't want to take up too much of your time here, is after the initial joint strikes between Israel and the U.S. were launched 4 weeks ago, a month previously, how do you think operationally the Secret Service changed? What was put into motion? Were there additional resources to, let's say, members of the family of President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance? And how do you think it's going to change so long as this prolongs?
Not at all. And I think we may have touched on this. I did some media a couple weeks ago with you and a couple other places where I was asked about that with this. We're being told there's a price on the president's head now. We went through that several times in my career where we heard that foreign governments had put a bounty out on the president. The level of protection around the president couldn't get higher. There really isn't anything more we could do. It is already at such a high level. And I mean, everything from, what you just see around the president, the men and women right around the president are really just an incredibly small number of the package of not just humans, but, advanced weaponry, electronic countermeasures, A lot of things I can't talk about, but,
We're
when
talking jammers on the motorcade. I lose service anytime
yeah,
the president goes by.
yeah. And that, the president gets, on an average, I think 6 or 7 threats a day. It started under President Clinton when kind of the internet came in, where instead of having to handwrite letters, people were able to email the White House, that we were averaging 5 threats a day. I think that stayed through my career pretty steady. I've been out a little while, so it may have ticked up a little bit. So let's say it's up to 7. All those are taken seriously. So if we're already getting 5 to 7 threats a day on the president, like, why wouldn't we have the protection as high as it could be? One more additional threat, regardless of whether it comes from a foreign government or some guy in a cabin in the woods, it doesn't matter. We're already as a high tempo and high stature as we could be.
And obviously, there's a level of risk there too. I mean, you said you can't get any higher, more protective than its current capacity in the Secret Service of protecting the president, but there's some risk too. Just think about what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania.
Sure. Yeah. And I was on the task force. I was asked by Congress to be on the task force as a special advisor that investigated that. And it was a failure. I was very frank that it was a huge failure by the Secret Service in planning and preparation. Very simple fixes to that problem that weren't put in place because of, very frankly, someone put in a position where they lacked the experience to handle a site like that, but also a lack of communication and a lack of mentoring. Those are my 3 big points that I came away from it with. I think that's fixed now. I think we're seeing, and I would look, and in defense of, as much as I can defend the people who were involved, the hardest thing I ever did in my Secret Service career were outdoor events. They are a monster. Sight lines go on for thousands of yards. Every shadow of a home or every shadow of a tree can be a sniper hidden somewhere. You look at a mortar, even a small mortar can fire from, a couple thousand yards away, which is out of the reach of any weapon that you're going to be able to mitigate it with. And they might not be able to be perfectly zeroed and hit the podium where the president's standing, but they're certainly going to cause panic and a mass casualty event, and they might just get lucky and hit him. So there's a lot that goes into outdoor events. And, I always said, and I know it'll never happen, but I always said I would have loved if we could have convinced everybody we protected to transition to indoor events and just never do any more outdoor rallies. But it's hard to tell them, hey, you can fit 20,000 people in this arena, or you can fit 50,000 in the fairgrounds. They're always going to pick the 50,000.
Yeah, I mean, imagery is powerful. Even President Trump knew that in the moment after that bullet flew. He came up out of that detail and put his fist in the air. He had a message to send, right?
Amazing. Yeah, amazing in that moment that was where his mind was. Yeah, for sure.
Jeff, I really appreciate all your time. Oh, by the way, you're talking about outdoor events. President Trump says he wants inaugurations in this big, beautiful ballroom. So maybe you will have that goal achieved, right?
Well, I tell you, there were a couple inaugurations where it was 20 degrees, so I wouldn't mind going inside. For sure.
Fair enough. Jeff, I appreciate your time. Great insight, and let's stay in touch. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate the time.
Thanks for listening to my chat with Jeff. Please subscribe to Byline with Ben Dennis wherever you get your podcasts. I'm on social media too. Broadcast Ben is the common handle on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter. Oh, Substack, Ben Reports. I'll be there with just some breakdown key moments of the interview, questions that are going to drive the headlines ahead. And again, the entire goal here, context, no spin, going beyond the headlines to find out why they matter. Oh, and if there's a question you think we should be asking next, I want to hear it. Let me know. We'll take it to the folks who are in the know. Take it easy.